Rada Savic to the stage for her presentation, which is entitled Critical Collaborations, Update and Future Direction for TB Reflect and TB PACS, which is the data platform supporting this work.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for coming. I think Christian and Deborah gave a very good introduction about what is this analysis about, and I have scheduled 1 hour and 10 minutes, and I'll make sure I don't go over because we have really a lot of results. So in case I go over, please warn me, but I have my watch and I'm very aware of that. So this is just to let you know, so this is a very much data presentation. So I'll be showing a lot of data, a lot of results, and we show first glimpse of these results back in Liverpool, but that was a very, very initial, and I think now we are almost completed this first round of the analysis. I also have to say that really these analyses were undertaken by Marjorie Imperial, who sits over in the corner. So she's really the one behind a lot of work together with the rest of my team. So, so clearly, I think by now we know that one regimen does not fit all. And that was very visible in 3 big trials where we've seen that 4 months worked really well for 80% of the patients. But nevertheless, it didn't work for everybody, and therefore we don't have a new regimen out there for these patients. And we also know there's a lot of reasons for differences in drug response, and there's a lot of trials and a lot of research going around these questions, namely what are the impact of clinical characteristics or disease burden is measured by different methods like chest X-ray and PET imaging and so on. There are different demographics predictors, there are more refined biomarkers. There's a lot of great work going on around understanding the drug response to TB drugs. And really, you know, our ultimate goal will be to identify the right regimen for the right patients to be given at the right time. So there's many right things that needs to happen in order to cure really everybody. And we are hoping really to have this smart and easy to use implement dosing algorithm eventually. We've heard that there's a lot of new drugs coming up, and these things, not a lot, but some drugs are coming up, and these things might be really very important going forward. So, so really, as Christian said and Deborah, we had a few analysis goals with these 3 analyses of 3 big trials. And first goal was really to understand drug response to different TB regimens, and really to identify patient groups that are already eligible for 4-month regimen. So out of these 80% that responded well with 4-month regimens, can we at least pinpoint who those are? So basically they might have a 4-month regimen already out there. Also to profile hard to treat patient populations, because you always talk about them, but we didn't really pinpoint with actual data and quantities to those. Also to try to identify drug-specific factors that are predicted of unfavorable response, because this is clearly the only intervention that we can do. We can actually change the regimen and we can impact how we're treating our patients. Also based on all of these analyses, trying to provide some directions for future clinical trials, and also to provide some data-driven evidence that might have an immediate impact on TB treatment implementations. So these are our aims, quite a few challenging aims. So database is integrated and standardized individual level data from 3 recent phase 3 trials, Alpha-Tab, Remox, and Rifacrin, through TB PACS. And I have only 1 slide on the database, but I really want to pinpoint that this is enormous work, and probably the biggest time limiting factor, because just the time to assemble the database, to resolve data queries, to understand how data code is really, really difficult. And I've been working on several of these analyses, and that really takes usually 70 to 80% of the time just to make sure the data sets are in place. And that really has been facilitated with CPTR. By CPTR, we would not be able to do much without that, because there's a lot of standardization going on just to make sure that we speak the same language across different trials. And I will have quite a few points about that. And this is like actually our first challenge and the first point. The outcome which was modeled and collected in 3 different trials was unfavorable outcome. And really that was very diverse definition in the 3 different studies. So all 3 different studies had very different definitions of what unfavorable outcome meant, and there was no really way for us to backtrack, for example, what true relapses would be, what true recurrences would be, and what true number of patients that might have died for other reasons. So really the entire database and the entire modeling that I will show today is based for unfavorable outcome, which can really happen anytime from initiation of the treatment at day 0 until the last day of the follow-up. Since we had quite few drug-related predictors, one thing that we've tried to do, which we thought it would be helpful because it really came across in our discussions with the steering committee of TB Reflect, is we tried to define recurrence. And by recurrence, we really mean all unfavorable outcomes minus treatment failure. So whoever had an unfavorable outcome on treatment during the first 6 months, we excluded them from that initial cohort, and that is the cohort that we call recurrence, because it means that the unfavorable outcome have happened after treatment was completed. And that will really enable us to look at drug-related predictors, and as you will see in our results later on. So this is really not true recurrence. I just need to clarify that because this cohort will include recurrence, relapses, and unfavorable outcomes for any other reasons that might have happened after treatment has been completed. But this is really probably the biggest challenge, and the biggest take-home point is that whatever we want to collect in phase 3 trials, we need really a good definition of those, and just to be able to differentiate between at least relapses and recurrences and unfavorable outcomes for other reasons. In terms of predictors, many trials collected many different things, but the common denominator was unfortunately quite small. So basically, only few common things were collected across 3 different trials, which enabled us to look at these predictors across the trials. And these were really classical demographic factors like weight, BMI, age, sex, race. So we had those across 3 different trials. In terms of clinical predictors, we did have a good amount of baseline smear, clearly HIV status, and in terms of chest X-ray readouts, the only thing that was common across 3 different trials was presence of cavities, yes, no, which I found quite unfortunate because there's a lot of information in chest X-rays that one can take. So, for example, Rifkin study collected the chest X-ray size, which is probably a very useful one, while Oflotab had a lot of detailed readouts from chest X-ray, like if disease was bilateral and the zone scoring and so on. But unfortunately, there was no common readout across different trials in those type of predictors. With respect to on-treatment results and early on-treatment drug response, we did have culture results at different months, and the one that was common across 3 different trials was month 2 and month 4. Unfortunately, we did not have common type of culture. For example, we didn't have liquid culture across 3 trials. So we had liquid culture results in 2 trials, but then there was 1 trial that only had solid culture results. So also there was not uniformity about type of the culture that was collected. And then with respect to drug, the nice thing is that we did have adherence across different trials. And by adherence, I mean we knew how many doses patients took versus how many they were supposed to take. And then we also had a very interesting one, which we just included recently, which is treatment duration. And that really means, you will see in a moment, that even if we had 6-month and 4-month arm, that doesn't necessarily mean that all patients took drugs within 6 months or 4 months. So there's a certain variation how long actually it takes patients to complete their treatment, which means we would know how many pills they took, and we would also know how long it took them to complete this treatment. So these were common predictors, and by common I mean that they had to be available in more than 80% of the patients in a trial, so that was our cutoff. We had other relevant predictors which were non-consistent, but nevertheless we did look into them in number of sub-analyses, like the smoking status was available in 2 out of 3 trials. Detailed readouts from chest X-ray, as I said, zone scoring bilateral disease were available in Oflotab, and cavity size was available in Rifkin. We had longitudinal midget data, some, not all, but we had some longitudinal time to positivity. No gene expert in this database, and we had a very limited factor of PK data, which were mostly collected in Aflatab, and also Rifakin had a very nice PK study for rifampicin and moxifloxacin. I also have to say that in terms of drugs, we are talking about 7 different drugs that were studied in these 3 trials, so actually understanding PK of each of these drugs is very, very challenging. This is just the tables, classical tables. In total, we have 1404 subjects in 6-month arm. This is HRZE, standard of care. And here you can see the numbers, which are coming from Rifakin, 188, Remorse 555, and Aflatab 661. And then we have 4 different arms that are coming, 4 different 4-month arms that are coming for 3 different trials. In total, giving us database around 2,000, not around, it is 2001 subject. So these are like just summary tables. The trials are quite similar in terms of demographics, demographic distribution. Also, this is just demographic distribution for HIV status and smear cavity presence. Across different arms, 6-month and 4-month, we had around 12 to 16% of HIV patients in this database. And I have to say right away that these HIV patients are quite different from HIV patients that we would enroll nowadays. So these are the HIV patients that are not on antiretrovirals, and therefore they probably have higher risk of failing TB treatment. So basically, taking HIV patients from these analyses, we cannot assume that they would respond same nowadays if they're like on antiretroviral therapy. So they're quite different from other HIV patients. So around 60% of the patients had cavities in both 6-month and 4-month arm. And with respect to the baseline smear, also that is one of the challenges. Different studies use different tables. Some studies use CDC tables, some studies use WHO tables. We, in the end, converted everything to WHO tables. So we have 3 categories, 1+, 2+, and 3+. Interestingly, we also had a subset of patients that had a negative smear at the study entry, around 6% of those. So this is just to show you like some in respect to the on-treatment things that were collected, and classical one is a smear. And we can see at baseline smear we have quite a lot of patients. Almost everybody has baseline smear, not all of them. And then some studies will collect in month 1 and month 2, month 3, month 4, month 6 are going forward. So the most common time points were month 2 and month 4 for the smear. And I have a very busy table coming up, which is culture. This is summary across different studies for solid culture, liquid culture, and solid or liquid culture. And what I wanted to point out here is that actually liquid culture results were missing in almost in half of the patients in this database. And solid culture results were missing. So what we settled on, just to use the culture as a predictor, was it would take in results or solid or liquid culture in month 2 and month 4. So later on, when I talk about culture type predictors, so this would be either solid or liquid culture at month 2 or month 4, depending what was available. Clearly, if we had both results, we would use liquid culture over the solid culture. So this is the interesting one, since we had quite a lot of discussion about drug adherence. And the data that I'm showing in this cohort, so this is what we call recurrence subset, meaning that this is a subset where we exclude all patients that actually had early failure. And the reason for that is because if you had the early failure, clearly your adherence would be very low because you didn't have time to complete your treatment. So these are the patients that actually completed their treatment and remain in the analysis. Whenever I talk about drug adherence or anything that has to do with the drug, actually I'm talking about this subgroup of patients. And clearly, in both HRCE and 4-month subset, there was a large percentage of patients that had full adherence, so 100% pills taken. But then you can see in these subgroups, we still have some data of the patients that actually did end up in the analysis, even if this is like a controlled clinical trial, that had drug adherence something in between 80 and 100%. I purposely am showing this table because even the definition of to be included in the analysis is to have adherence larger than 80%. Actually, they gave us a lot of insight in understanding why patients might have failed. So I just want to pinpoint that we do have some data of the patient that had adherence between 80 and 100%, and these are the percentages. With respect to treatment duration, as I mentioned earlier, so this is just a summary of actual treatment duration from the time they started the treatment and the time they actually completed the treatment. And as I said earlier, again, this is the subgroup of patients that did not fail within 6 months. And as I said earlier, that there's quite a lot of variations in that time aspect, how long it takes for patients to complete the treatment. And the reasons are multiple. The reasons might be that the treatments were interrupted because of the side effects, or they were off the treatment, they came back. So therefore, that treatment duration varies. We don't have actual reasons why duration might vary, but these are the usual ones. The whole point is that actually even in HRZE group we had quite varying duration, which went down from maybe 5 months up to more than 6.5 months, up to 7 months. So and that's quite nice, because now we actually do have this variability in how long it takes to complete the regimen. And when it comes to 4 months, we also have variation between 4 and 5 months. So basically we are overlapping these two groups in terms of treatment duration. So we have a full continuum when we talk about treatment duration. And that's what actually helps us move away from the analysis, is it 4 or 6? We can actually start asking the question, what is the optimal and how does treatment duration impacts the outcomes? And I'm very glad that we managed to pull out this data, because this is really down to our major question, how short we can go with these type of regimens. So this is just, again, busy table to understand you how we divided the database. We started with 3411 in the entire database, and then we split them clearly in standard care and 4-month MITT sub-cohorts, this is basically what was available in original trials, and then we went down to PP analysis, the protocol analysis, as it was defined in the major trials. So we haven't changed any of the definitions. And then I said, then we also created these 2 additional cohorts where we excluded early failures in order to create something that might be called recurrence analysis. This is just a standard thing. This plot is just showing correlation between our predictors that we've used. That is like a typical step we do in every data analysis, make sure that any of our predictors are not very highly correlated. And only weight and BMI clearly were correlated. The intensity of the dot says if correlation is present. And then blue means positive, red means negative. And only the typical one we've seen, basically weight and BMI, positive correlation and negative correlation between HIV status and CD4 counts. So basically there was no any other things to be worried about. So there was a lot of different analyses that went into this. And I will not, and that is very complex. As Deborah said, we outline everything, statistical plan, and on top of that, we actually think we perform many more additional analyses. But there's a lot of things that we had to think about before actually doing any analysis. So clearly, first, we have a lot of missing predictors across different 3 trials, and they're just showing you some thinking how we actually reached out the cohort that we'll be using. There's so there's a missing data aspect of this analysis, which is very relevant and statistically important. Then we have some predictors in 2 out of 3 trials, and how do we deal with those, and how do we integrate information? We had different analysis cohorts, subsets, so MITT and PP, and for unfavorable outcomes and also for recurrence. So there's at least 4 different analysis sets that are always going on. We also have different methodology that we are using to analyze this data, which is time to event data. So usual statistical analysis is proportional Cox hazard. This is what you really see in all journals. But then we also are performing parametric survival analysis, which are very useful in terms of quantification of these results and actually making inference what that means going forward, and also for clinical trial simulations. Whenever we are working with predictors, there are very different search methodologies. So we've been performing forward-backward search, which is appropriate for this analysis, given that still we have less number of predictors than we have patients in the data set. But we've also performed lasso methodology, which is very, very stringent and takes care of correlated covariates. And then we have non-inferiority tests. So there's a lot of, you can see a combination of all of these that actually went into our thinking. And today, I will be showing only, since there's still, even if I have an hour, there's a limited time, so I will be showing results from MITT analysis and MITT minus early failure. So I will not be showing PP, and I will show results from forward, backward. I will not show results from the lasso, but that all exists. And basically, if there is any inconsistency going on, I would be pinpointing that. But MITT was our cohort of choice because we have a lot, most unfavorable outcomes and most events in that analysis, and that analysis really enables us to learn the most. Okay, so that was my intro, and now we'll jump into results. So for 6 months, HRZE, we know that the outcomes across three different studies were very comparable and were very good. And this is really the analysis, univariate analysis of HRZE MITT cohort when we don't actually think about the drug. So here we have unfavorable outcomes. And you can see that there's a number of significant predictors that are coming in. So month 4 culture, HIV positive status, month 2 culture, age, older age. I should describe actually this plot because I will be showing a lot of these plots. So if there's a continuous covariate and then hazard is moved to the right, that means that higher value of the covariate is given higher hazard. So every time you're comparing, for example, older age means higher hazard. If it's continuous vary to the left, then, for example, for BMI and for weight, you can see down there, that will mean that higher value of the covariate, so higher weight and higher BMI has lower hazard, is protective. And I will be pinpointing those. So this is univariate analysis, quite a few significant ones. The interesting thing is really what remains. In terms of baseline, just thinking about the baseline for HRZE, so really not thinking about drugs, so just patient at the entry point. In the multivariate analysis, these are the 4 factors that came in. So clearly HIV status, which I've already explained. Those patients had 2.36 higher hazard of having an unfavorable outcome. Older age, lighter patients, so malnourished patients, and also males. So these were the common patients that were at higher risk just based on their baseline factors if they receive HRZE. If we add culture, if we had on-treatment culture, then month 4 and month 2, they're both risk factors. So this means that we actually, in multivariate analysis, we are adjusting for, so basically both month 4 and month 2 are risk factors, meaning that if you're positive at both occasions, you have higher risk than if you're positive only at one occasion. And HIV status. So this is what is remained in the analysis, and females are still having lower hazard of having a relapse. In all of these tables, there are p-values. They're very detailed. These detailed plots, they have p-values. They have number of test arm and with percentages of unfavorable outcomes, and also number of the other group with percentages of unfavorable outcomes. So, for example, you can see that for HIV status, we have 156 patients that are HIV positive, and out of these 156, we have 17% failures compared to the rest of the data with 11% of unfavorable outcomes. So this is just some plots, just to visualize what I mean. So HIV is in red, males are in red, 4-month culture, 2-month culture. So this is just if we visualize. I think the interesting thing that we've seen is with 2-month culture here, and you can see that within the first 6 months, if you do look, and I hope I do have yeah. If you do look at the red curve to start with on treatment, one can see if you're culture positive, actually, these curves, they cross after the treatment has been completed, meaning that patients that are culture negative in month 2, they start actually dropping at a faster rate than the patient that culture positive, which was just interesting trend that we have observed. This is not the case for month 4 culture. So now, really, when we switch from this MITT analysis and to recurrence, we are able to incorporate drug adherence and treatment duration, which are the drug-related factors, which are very, very interesting ones for us, given that this is intervention that we can change. And so this is also univariate analysis first, now when we have all of these predictors. And you can see the number one, adherence. So basically, even if we had a small portion of these patients that did have adherence less than 90%, and we did group them in these groups just to have something to work with, so if you do drop more than 10% of your drugs, your hazard actually of having a relapse is 4 times higher. And that was really the strongest predictor out of all other predictors. And you can see the relative size compared to even 4-month culture or 2-month culture HIV status. So this was really the strongest one. When we do multivariate analysis, which is really what remains, again, the adherence is top one driver for failures in standard of care. Month 4 culture, HIV status, month 2 culture, so all of these things matter. You can see where the adherence, if you're adherent between 9 to 99%, actually you're not significant. So this is where it falls. And then females having lower hazard, and really the interesting one is treatment duration. This means, it's a significant one. This means that if you have longer treatment duration, and the value that I'm showing here is for difference of 28 days from the median. So if you have completed your treatment within 7 months versus 6 months, actually your hazard of failing is lower. Clearly, I don't think that this can go forever. You cannot expect patients to complete the treatment within a year and still have a lower hazard. But for me, this is a very interesting observation, meaning that actually for how long it takes you to complete that regimen, independently of number of pills that you take, it matters. At least, there's many things we can discuss about treatment duration, why treatment duration is prolonged or shorter, but I think this is the first time we're actually getting into this question, how the adherence and number of pills and how duration actually, how they interplay in response to TB outcome. Just to visualize the drug adherence, because I've got a lot of questions about it during this work. So these are just the raw data plots where we use different cutoffs for HRZE. So that's what that really means. In the first plot, we just compare groups with 100% adherence versus everybody else. And then in the other groups, we put cutoff at 95, meaning we compare 100 versus 95 versus less than 95, and so on. And you can see how, depending where we put that cutoff value, how these actually plots are separating. And really, in the last one, we can see if you're having adherence less than 80%, what your survival plot would look like. Clearly, these are, again, very detailed plots. In parentheses, there are numbers of patients that get into this analysis, and further we move this cutoff, clearly we have less and less patients because, again, this is a setting of a controlled clinical trial, so adherence is in generally good, but nevertheless, I think we have a very clear signal there. So just to summarize, HRZE, this is just standard care. So failures in standard care, the most significant really risk factor was adherence, losing more than 10% of the drugs, which is not a lot. So this is really losing 1 pill every 10 days. So this was one of the biggest significant predictors of treatment failures. In terms of baseline risk factors, HIV status, older underweight patients, they will in common having higher risk from unfavorable outcome. We have indications that actually longer duration matters and will be beneficial for the treatment. In terms of culture-based predictors, what we've learned is that combined 4 and 2-month culture is better than 4-month and is better than 2-month. In terms of ranking, that would be the way to rank. And some of the strategies to improve really outcomes for HRZE is really to encourage adherence. And I think I'm here preaching to converted, but I think this is the first time we actually have quantitative data in the setting of controlled clinical trial. Okay, so now switching gears, probably the a little bit more exciting part, which is analysis of 4-month regimen. And I have a same setup. So first I will show you just MITT for unfavorable, and then I will show you MITT for recurrence. So for MITT analysis for unfavorable outcomes, so here I'm just looking at the baseline and culture, so we're not looking into drug. Clearly, we have a lot more predictors. This is univariate analysis. So month 2 now becomes very important. I have to pinpoint that for 4-month analysis, we're not using month 4 culture because we thought it's not much of a use to look at the culture in month 4 when you actually already can know if you are failing treatment or not, in order to predict the failure. So now I think the really interesting things do appear is this profiling of hard to treat patients. So smear status 3+ versus smear status 1+. Clearly there's an increased hazard of failure. HIV status is still there. Smear 2+ versus 1+ is not significant, but clearly there is a trend. Presence of cavities now become important. Age still remains, so older patients are very consistent demographic factors, age, BMI, and females are basically having lower hazard. So this is in univariate analysis. So let's take a look what remains if we do multivariate. So basically all of these factors do matter after accounting one for all of them. So the strongest one is really baseline smear. So this really tells us that patients with baseline smear were the one probably highly likely to fail with 4-month regimen, and HIV status, and older patients, and males. So this is only based on baseline predictors. So this is just, as I said, baseline. So if we add culture to this, month 2 culture is very strong, and in addition to smear 3+ to 1+, and BMI remains in as well as age and sex. So just to visualize some of these results, again, this is the survival curves for smear and culture, and really my favorite curve is the smear status, because you can see how it nicely aligns. So really the patients with smear 1+, they're better than patients with smear 2+ and orange, and they're better than patients with smear 3+, which is red. So just looking at the data, I think this is a very nice plot, because I think in all diseases, the treatment response, drug response is very dependent on severity of the disease at the baseline. And I think this is what we're showing here as well. So more plots, again, just to pinpoint these predictors. So HIV status and BMI. In the red, we are showing the BMI patients with BMI less than 17.1. So they're clearly nicely separating. And then age and gender, again, in the red, is age, which is more than 35 years old, because this is quite tight range, and versus the rest. This is just the way we kind of make those cutoffs. But clearly, older you are, you have higher hazard of failing, and the males which are in red. So this is, again, just a visualization. So now I will show you the results from analysis of recurrence with 4-month regimens, where we actually incorporating drug-related factors. And I'm so sorry, but I should have said in the beginning, all of these analyses are adjusted for site. We also adjusted analysis for study, and we've done analysis without adjustment. So basically, what I'm showing, we already have adjusted for site, because that was the question that, again, is arising, because these are different sites and different studies, and most of the things are consistent. Okay, so for 4-month analysis, when we actually do add treatment, again, adherence less than 90% is number 1, with the highest hazard ratio. And then you can see the rest of these factors. Again, you can see on the bottom of the list, treatment duration is showing up in the same direction, again, meaning that giving for longer time is actually beneficial for a patient. If we look at the multivariate, again, just based on baseline and drug, so here we are combining baseline and drug. Drug adherence less than 90% is really top 1, hazard ratio of 3, smear 3+1 remains age, BMI, females, the treatment duration. Again, what this means, that risk factors for failing 4-month regimen is not completing your treatment, losing more than 10% of the pills, having very high baseline smear, being older, having lower BMI, being a male, and completing your treatment in a shorter duration of time. And this is also if you add the culture, where actually culture comes in as well, mantle culture, and then the rest, most of it remains. So again, just to visualize that, drug adherence and treatment duration, it is hard to visualize this on the baseline, on the raw data for treatment duration, because we have to adjust for a few things. But nevertheless, I decided to show these figures, because this is just visualization of the raw data. So this is not, this is just to convince you that what the data look like if you look at every of these factors on its own. Again, the drug adherence, just for, given that we've got a lot of questions again, you can see again how even for 4 months, the drug adherence less than, depending where we put that cutoff, is really separating more and more and more, meaning that more drug adherence, more loss in drug adherence is giving us higher risk for treatment, for unfavorable outcome, or for recurrence. So we've done all of these analysis, and now the question was, okay, so we do have risk factors, and can we actually perform non-inferiority test the same way that it was performed in the major clinical trials, and can we identify groups that actually are non-inferior to 6 month to control that can be administered 4-month regimen. So this is again very busy plot. But it is non-inferiority test, where we are comparing 4-month subgroups, so subgroups of patients receiving 4 months versus full HRZE. And to the right, if the blue line is to the right, that means that that particular subgroup is favoring longer regimen, while if to the left, basically that subgroup might be considered receiving shorter regimen, and if the color is in the red, that means that that particular subgroup is non-inferior when compared to full HRZE. So we are comparing to full HRZE analysis. On the left, Marjorie nicely color-coded these factors. So we have subgrouping based on baseline smear, HIV status, and cavity presence. So because these are really our 3 major factors. And on the right, there's a lot of numbers, but basically these numbers are telling us in much detail how many patients we have, how many unfavorable outcomes we have, what are the point differences, confidence intervals, and so on. So really all informations are in this plot. But what I wanted to point out here, you can see clearly, if you look at the green, what is really green, meaning these are our factors that are actually protective, or actually they're beneficial for 4-month regimen. We have really seen very uniform patterns, so smear 1+, cavity negative, HIV negative, and different subgroup of these patients actually, depending on the way we group them, are non-inferior to the standard of care. Really, you can see on the bottom that basically smear 1+, all HIV negative patients, as well as all patients who do not have cavities, irrespective of the smear, they would be non-inferior. So the way we made these groups, we just actually made all possible groupings, and we included only the groupings that have at least 200 patients in them, because we always, and the reason why we did that, because we always get this question, how about HIV positive without cavities, or so we get a lot of these specific questions, so at least we have full results here, and we can pull out any result of interest to you. So this is again a comparison of 4-month subgroups versus full HRZE. In this graph, so we are performing a little bit more stringent analysis, and we are actually comparing subgroup to a subgroup. So the same patient subgroups we're comparing at 4 months, they received 4 months, versus the same patient subgroups that received the 6 months. And we still actually, we have less groups now, because clearly some of these risk factors are common across different regimens. regimens, but I think still we do see that all patients that have cavity, that do not have cavities, and all patients that smear 1+ and the one that smear 2+ without cavities are actually non-inferior to same subgroup receiving HRCE. So this really, in context of the trial results, this means that we have identified subgroups of patients from Remox, Rifaprin, and Oflotab that actually would satisfy non-inferiority test to be receiving 4-month regimen, and they would be eligible for these 4-month regimens going forward. In a similar way, we've started thinking, okay, what if we compare the same test, and if we actually start comparing subgroups on HRCE versus entire HRCE? And the really thinking behind this was, what if we actually start playing with HRCE, and can we actually shorter HRCE? Because we know that we can shorter HRCE to 4 months, and we will still have maybe 80% of the favorable outcomes, and that would be really the simplest thing to do. So basically, instead of going for 6 months with HRCE, there's certain subgroups actually be able to go to 4 months. And there's a little bit more complex thinking behind this, but here we are just comparing subgroup to entire cohort as if we would run a trial in a subgroup of patients with low risk factors and compare them to another arm which would have everybody. And here in green, actually this means that if that trial would have been run, that trial would be superior compared to standard of care. This really means if you do run a trial in smear 2+, smear 1+, 2+, cavity negative, basically that trial, and we give them 6 months of HRCE, that would be superior trial compared to everybody else, which is not, I think everybody has a sense that would be the case. Clearly, those patients will all be cured with 6 months HRCE, but then it gives us really this indication that probably we have material to shorten HRCE if we want in certain subgroups that are at low risk, which again would be immediate programmatic impact. Then we also asked the question, actually I have to thank Carl Mendel because he asked me to make this plot, and that would be interesting to see, is what if we actually start comparing subgroups in patients with low adherence versus high adherence, and how that would look like. And this is 2 types of plots, so basically similar non-inferiority plot, but this really says what would happen if you compare group with has adherence less than 80%, less than 90%, less than 95%, and so on. So basically a subset in patients depending how many pills they took, and then we compare them to everybody else. And you can see here the point difference, meaning of increase in relapse rates if we do subsetting like that. And here we are talking about increase in relapse is around 60 to 80% in those subgroups. And again, this is a very, very strong change in relapse rates in patients that do not take adherence. And the reason why and then I'm showing the same test for MITT recurrence, and I have to say that in MITT plot, in the upper plot, the way we handle drug adherence, so here we are including also early failures, but if you were on treatment and you took every single pill of yours, so basically if you took 100% of the pills, but nevertheless you're failing, so we assume that you took 100% of the drugs up to the point when you failed on treatment. But the whole point here is that this really, I think, these adherence things mess up the non-inferiority test, because in our non-inferiority testing, we actually do include patients with a lot of different adherence profiles above 80%, and depending how we would make these cutoffs, who gets to be non-inferiority analysis for PP or MITT, non-inferiority results would have been different. But if we would have, if we would have means to actually just take out these non-adherent patients and out of the analysis, I think the whole non-inferiority testing would have looked different. Overall, patients that do not take their drugs, they really have much higher hazard ratios compared to the rest, and they would actually, they're probably the major drivers of non-inferiority failing. And this is similar thing for 4-month arm. So now we have all these results, and we do we have shown that certain groups, subgroups, are showing non-inferiority, and the question is, what does it mean in terms of our patient population? So this table just stratify our patient database, so our typical patients, in terms of percentages. And the way we stratify, so basically HIV, by smear status and by cavity status, and the percentages mean what is the percentage of entire population in this particular subgroup. So for example, 1.7% means that we had 1.7% HIV positive patients with SMER1 which are cavity negative. So that is, so basically this tells us who are our patients in our databases. And clearly one thing to pinpoint is that we have very few HIV patients, and most of the HIV patients are coming SMER3 plus, cavity plus. So this is our HIV population. Clearly we have in our clinical trials, most of the patients are HIV negative, and you can see distribution of the patients. So we have around 1/3 of the patients that are cavity positive and SMER3 positive. Which are characteristics of these hard-to-treat patients. And then we have different distribution of these other combinations based on smear and based on cavity size. So if we go back now and start thinking about who was non-inferior based on our testing for 4 months versus 6 months, everybody who was SMER1 plus was non-inferior, so that probably makes them eligible for 4-month regimen, so SMER1 plus. Everybody who was cavity negative was non-inferior, and then also we have a SMER2 plus cavity negative. So these are the subgroups that satisfy non-inferiority test, and that really makes, if we sum up these numbers, that comes to 40.9% of these patients. So this is 1/4 of our subpopulations, and we can call them easy to treat. And they're probably ones that can easily go with 4-month regimen. So this is, I understand that this is not 80% of the patients that responded well on 4 months, but it's half of those. And I think it still makes it worthwhile for a lot of patients that these new regimens would actually be good for half of the patients that responded well. So in terms of hard to treat, we definitely do have our risk factors, baseline risk factors, SMER3 plus and cavity positive. So that makes around 39.4% of these hard to treat patients that probably need 6 months or even longer, depending on the regimen that we are talking about. And then we have this thing in the middle, which to these patients that might go for shorter, might go for longer, and we would need more detailed results. Clearly, this is a very basic grouping and stratification, but we made, given that these were the factors that were available to us, and this can become much more refined if we would include more predictors on the baseline, especially from chest X-ray, GeneXpert, and so on. But I think this is what we have enough evidence now, given these databases. So, okay, so I've have now some pieces of results that I found very interesting, and I still have time, so I will show you to this. So I've shown results 6 months, 4 months, and the reason for that was really to get to this non-inferiority test and understand who would be eligible for 4 months treatment from these big trials. So once we start seeing this variability in duration between different arms, one thing that we've said to us, what about merging entire database? And then when we merge entire database, we can handle differences in between different regimens. So we do know duration of regimen, and we do know how many rifampin pills every patient took. Or how many pills, prescribed pills of all drug. And that is really getting down to a question, how many pills, how much drug versus how long you need to actually to have a successful outcome. And we're just interested to see how these results would look if you actually merge everything together. Again, I'm reminding, this is what I'm saying, so we have this variability in adherence, and most importantly, we have this variability in duration, and there's a certain overlap between 2 different big duration groups, 4 and 6 months, and we think that can actually help us get at our question. So again, I will remind you the way we are handling the drug. It is not adherence. We actually count number of pills that they took. So basically, for 4-month arm, they would take 120 pills on average of rifampin plus the rest, and for 6 months they would take 180. So basically, we have a way to handle these differences in the treatment between 2 different arms. And this is like just if we ask the questions for univariate analysis, and clearly all 4-month arms there on the top, this is for univariate analysis, only one single factor, so they all clearly have higher hazard of having unfavorable outcome because this is univariate analysis. And then there's another things that overlap. But I think the really interesting one is full database, and we do recurrence for multivariate analysis. So this means that all of these factors are adjusted for, and so we have MANTO culture is a big risk factor, HIV status, so the usual ones. So basically, all of these factors matter for 4 months and for 6 months, which is nice. But now we have these new things, total number of doses and treatment duration, which actually are both in there, meaning that clearly total number of doses, more doses, gives you lower hazard of having unfavorable outcome, but also longer duration. And then both of these things, they do matter. So basically how much drug you receive and for how long you go. And from these plots, it's hard to say how many drugs, how many pills you need and for how long you need to go. But that is something that actually we are hopeful now that we'll be able to get to with this type of analysis once when we switch to parametric survival modeling, then we actually can introduce exposure response or dose response and so on. And then clearly, I think the interesting thing is once we account for number of pills and for duration, for other risk factors, we can see that all 4-month arms actually having lower hazard, they're shifting to the left. And that really means, what it means to me that all of these four experimental regimens were a good idea, and they were actually better than what HRZ might have been at 4 months, but they were just not good enough. So probably they were 5 months, and that's what we often hear, that it's probably 5-month regimen than 6-month regimen. But once we account for number of rifampin pills and duration, actually those experimental arms are giving us lower hazard and saying that basically they do have advantage over the standard of care. I think there's much more to do here. Clearly, we're just here counting number of pills because this is the raw data available, and we will be switching to number of doses, to PK things, and we will be getting into the depth of this. But really, the point here is that we are hoping to actually get to the question: what is the duration versus intensity of the regimen, which is I think very important one. As I said, we had also a lot of other candidate predictors which were inconsistent across different trials, which we find they might be very promising and very good, but we haven't included them in this primary analysis because of they were available in different subsets. But I just wanted to show you a few of those. AlphaStab had a really beautiful chest X-ray data, and they have this scoring system, a zone score, and higher score means more disease, and there are very detailed descriptions in terms of what include into the scoring system. And then we had this grade: is it extensive disease or is it bilateral disease? We also had a cavity size, which was only available in Rifakin. But these are all significant chest X-ray predictors that we've identified. These are univariate analysis in the subset that has this predictor, that has this measurement. And you can see, and then in purple, these are from the baseline, and in the blue is end of treatment for HRZE. So in terms of baseline predictors, which are really interesting because they can help us actually profile hard to treat patients. Cavity size, even if it was collected only in Rifakin and it was a very small study, I found it really interesting that it actually hazard ratio around 3. Based on very small, you can see 116 patients were plus 30, so only 30 patients had a large cavity size, and 30% of those actually had unfavorable outcome in HRZE. So I think that is a very promising one, and cavity size in Rifakin was, I think, 1 to 5 centimeters and larger than 5 centimeters, or 4 centimeters was cut off. Amina is here, she'll probably correct me later. But there was a cutoff in terms of cavity size. And the other baseline, promising baseline predictor was this scoring system, or probably any measurement of high burden disease, either by scoring or by the different ways to actually quantify that. But these are very promising and probably much better predictors of unfavorable response than smear 3+, or like just a cavity yes/no, which we had available. This is something that definitely would be very valuable going forward. And actually, even now, if we would be able to reread those chest X-rays, we probably would be able to refine these algorithms even further. At the end of treatment in blue, so basically there's many more potential risk factors for treatment for unfavorable outcome, clearly extensive, and usually these are all the usual suspects. So if you still have a lot of disease in the end of treatment, your risk factors your hazard ratio is quite high. Interestingly, that all this is for 4 months, the same plot. Again, all of these predictors are the same, so basically for 4 months and 6 months, and again it gives us good confidence that these will be regimen independent, especially the baseline factors like cavity size and extensive disease at the baseline are very good risk factors for potential treatment individualization. We also had a lot of culture taints, and this is again quite busy. But basically a lot of microbiology predictors, and that is the way CPTR these databases is very nice. So you have a separate file on all microbiology. And there's a lot of smear results, a lot of culture results, yes, no culture and solid, and then also a lot of time to positivity results. And this was a really busy database, and here are different months, and then in colors are different microbiologies, it's smear or culture or time to positivity. Again, these are only significant ones. Clearly later in the treatment, measuring culture later in the treatment gives you higher hazard. That is really take out from this plot. Probably the strongest one is if you still smear positive towards the end, you're very high, you're a high candidate for treatment failure or for recurrence. But we don't have so many patients that still smear positive towards the end of the treatment. So, but again, these are all candidates. They're probably very promising, and if we would have had them in the entire database, some of these would probably be very useful. And the same is for 4-month regimen. Again, we see similar that at month 4, smear status, for example, gives you 4 times higher hazard of having unfavorable outcome, and so on. So later in the treatment, positivity, it is in general associated with unfavorable outcome. And last but not the least, I know many of you think, okay, well, looking at adherence and duration, but really what we're down there is around to understand these pharmacological type of predictors and what has to do with the PK. As I said earlier, we had very few PK data, which is really unfortunate because clearly there's so many things that we don't know about these drugs in terms of the PK-PD relationship. And we know that many of these drugs are not dosed at the top of dose response curve, at the doses that actually gives you maximal efficacy. And all of these drugs have very large variability in PK, so we know all of that. And which really means that PK remains very important, even if these trials are phase 3 trials. So this is our PK database. So we had 343 individuals that had HRZ from oflotab. We had 169 subjects with PK on rifloxacin and 241 subjects with moxifloxacin in rifapentine in Rifakin. So this is a very small portion. So our database had 3,500 people. So you can see that only small portion of patients had some PK, and this means that they had PK on some drugs. They didn't have PK on all drugs which are in the regimen. What we've done, actually, before going here, we've done a lot of work because we know we have 7 drugs, and we have some actual PK, but we also know that PK parameters can be considered and are actually function of different predictors like weight and BMI and age and some other covariates actually we do have available. So what we have done, we actually went back and reviewed the entire literature on PK models and tried to impute PK variables based on individual patient covariates. So we do have individual dose, and we do have individual weight or age and so on, fat-free mass and so on, and then from that, we are able to imply what the likely PK would be. This is not clearly the best approach, but it is the best we can do in absence of PK data, and I think some of these models are very well defined, basically how clearance depends on age and weight, and that actually helps us infer what the PK might have been in these patients. So we've done that for all 7 drugs, and this is again busy table, but this is a summary of AUC, cumulative AUC, and Cmax for all drugs from all trials. So basically we did imputation for 7 drugs for all patients in the database. And I will just show you just some first glimpse of the results, but we will definitely be going into these PK-dependent predictors in addition to this primary analysis that I've shown you. There's a big criticism about it because a lot of our things will be imputed, right? Because we are imputing PK for around 80% of the patients, but nevertheless, we think it's going to still provide us with a very useful insight into relevance of PK going forward. And I will show you just here, so this is for HRZE. If we do test just rifampin-dependent predictors for HRZE, and this is univariate analysis, clearly adherence was the one that I already shown you before, and then we have like steady-state rifampin AUC and Cmax and so on. So some of them go left to the right. These are unadjusted analysis, so they do give us some signal, but I think for HRZ, we don't have much of the signal, but interestingly, for 4 months, you can see in the bold are the ones that actually are coming up significant. And in addition to treatment duration adherence, which I already talked to you about, we can see that actually rifampin Cmax is coming significant, meaning that high rifampin Cmax was protective for unfavorable outcome, which again pinpoints this question that actually increasing rifampin will matter and might make a difference. And then if we again do the full database, now we have much more power and we are able to actually see the total rifampin dose, rifampin Cmax, and some of the PK predictors might actually be important. This is I'm just wanted to show you what we'll be doing. There's clearly many more things that we have to incorporate in terms of multifloxacin, multifloxacin, and fluoroquinolones, so INH, so we have all of these drugs on board, but that will really make it for an interesting analysis because we'll be able to, we'll try if we can get actually down to this regimen composition and the dose question and so on. I have to say, I've talked about efficacy. There's entire effort going on safety analysis, and we don't I have just a couple of slides summary to tell you about safety of HRZE, or basically to tell you about challenges to analyze safety in the same aspect. So, and this is really Tom Peppard from Sir Tara Gates Foundation who put these slides, and he's really dealing with these very complicated issues with the database. But again, the biggest challenge is there's no consistency across the databases. And for example, for adverse events, only Oflotab captured and coded adverse events. In REMOX, adverse events were captured but not coded. In Rifakin, only serious adverse events were captured. So, so really, to actually come up with a database of safety events is very challenging, and at this stage we are trying to resolve that. There's some biochemistry and hematology which is useful, and for example, in terms of scheduled laboratory tests, if we have data available, you can see for Rifakin, Oflotab, and REMOX, they were collected at different time points, clearly at baseline. All of them, and then some of them had longitudinal data. REMOX had a very nice longitudinal data for safety tests up to month 4. And in terms of panel, we had bilirubin. It was not captured in Oflotab, but you can see that there's quite a diversity in terms of what kind of safety data we have available. So we're working on that to come up to that. As I said, this is the longest part in any merged data analysis. It takes a long time to come up with useful databases to work on. But we are hoping to provide more results on this going forward. All this will be very challenging without coded adverse events to make this in a way that we would all expect. And finally, just some summary points right on time. So really, in respect to treatment implications, what we've learned up to now, so we have identified around 35 to 40%, depending if you want to include HIV patients with SMER1 or not, that actually are non-inferior for 4-month regimen based on MITT analysis. I think we could consider standard care in those patients group if full adherence. So clearly adherence here is imperative. This is probably something that might have immediate programmatic impact. I just think in encouraging adherence in general, clearly it was very visible that that was something that would bring us down to probably very low rates of unfavorable outcomes in standard care. So clearly the most impactful intervention for HRZE is ensuring adequate adherence and basic number of pills. In general, there's a lot of these questions about forgiveness of HRZE. So can you actually, what is forgiveness of this regimen in terms from adherence point of view? And I think what we've seen is actually fairly low, very low forgiveness, given that even if you miss more than 10% of the doses, you are really, that is a really big risk factor. And that's something to expect for rifampin. Whoever knows pharmacology, rifampin has a very short half-life, is in and out. So basically, if you don't keep giving it, bacteria will actually easily regrow. There was a lot of variation and this is more variation due to actual disease than due to a regimen. So really like being cavity positive and SMER3+ was a very strong risk factor for 4-month analysis. And also it seemed the treatment duration has independent impact, and this is definitely something we'll be exploring further. In respect to design of future clinical trials, I think this really, at least to me, it's very clear that concept of one duration for all is clearly not valid. It will become even more complicated given how many new regimens we will have. So some regimens might be given shorter, some might be longer, but also on the individual level, some patients might go shorter, some patients might go longer. Clearly, we need more aggressive treatments and regimens for hard-to-treat patients, but more aggressive, it can be either higher doses or longer duration. That is something that can be discussed. And these simple algorithms that we came up with, they're definitely intending to evolve. I don't think that anybody of us wants to keep working with SMER3+ going forward, but they would definitely become more precise with more detailed data, like gene expert at the baseline and more detailed chest X-ray, whatever is programmatically feasible. Some of the more refined ones might be feasible and available in program settings. Clearly, with more biomarkers and more detailed chest lung readouts, that would be even much better, but then the cost comes in. So in terms of clinical trial design, because this is also one of our tasks, I think really the biggest one, I think it's very clear that there's no consistency across the trials in collecting clinical data. And it was really, we did combine the best we could, but there's a lot of criticism that can arise. That is probably the first thing that would have to be addressed going forward if we as a group want to keep learning together. Definition of phase 3 clinical trial endpoint, in my personal opinion, I think should be at the minimum the separation from recurrence and or relapse versus others, because I think there's a lot of different information that one can get if you know if this is a true recurrence or relapse, or if it's different from just death for different reasons. So that was probably the one I would have wished most to have in this analysis. So in terms of culture, we do have a lot of culture data, and I would say definitely culture results are very relevant risk factors. As you've seen, they were associated with unfavorable outcomes in all our analysis. However, individual culture is not able to predict individual relapse. So, and that is something that we've seen in many other analyses that I haven't shown today, but just knowing your culture status, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will definitely relapse. So I think also one thing that as a group should think is that MITT sub-cohorts, more intention to treat, and per protocol, these definitions, they really need to be re-examined, especially because we've seen how adherence actually becomes a very important factor in all of what you're going to see as an unfavorable outcome. And for example, we had most of the unfavorable outcomes in standard care were due to inadequate adherence. So really what gets into those subsets, it's very, can be definitely impact the results of your analysis. The nice thing would have been if we would had sets of standardized predictors across different trials. Again, we had a lot of nice data from individual trials, but they were not available from main trials, and that is what we need because clearly the power of our trials is a big issue, given that our endpoint is so hard to learn from. And clearly incorporation of PK data and also detailed adherence histories. I've shown you now results of sum-up adherence, and some comments I've had were like, oh, but are you sure that all those pills were taken? Does it matter if you take 5 days and then you drop 2 days? So really these patterns of adherence, that is some at least we have shown in HIV and HCV field that these were one of the most important factors, and they really matter how you take your drug, if adherence matters. So really, this is our first set of results, I would say final results. And we have a lot of future work that will be coming up. So we're incorporating PK data, as I've shown you. We'll be analyzing treatment failures. So basically, we'll just look at the patient that failed on the treatment versus treatment time. As I said, we're doing parametric survival modeling, which is a very nice approach once we start asking the question how much, how long, and what are, how certain changes would actually impact future clinical trials or actual treatment as such. So they're very suitable for simulations. We will also be looking to modeling longitudinal culture data. Since we have this time course, you've seen that we do have some time course of culture data and doing further safety analysis. With that, right on time, 10:40, I acknowledge many of you, World Health Organization and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, many data contributors, CPT, I mean, all of you, really. I'm so privileged that we were actually being trusted to start this work, and thank you for having the trust in us.
Yeah, so thanks a lot, Radha. That was absolutely brilliant. So we'll have, after the break, the panel discussion with Radha again, Payam, Naid, Dave Herman, Patrick Phillips, Catherine Fielding, and Amina Jindani. And then we'll have about 45 minutes discussion, first with the panel and then with the audience. So thank you very much, and thanks again, Radha. It's absolutely brilliant work that was done. Congratulations.